The black belt instructor thought it would be funny to challenge the janitor to a friendly spar, but what transpired next silenced the entire martial arts gym. "Hey you, cleaning guy, how about a quick demonstration?" Derek Mitchell yelled from the center of the mat, his black belt gleaming under the fluorescent lights. "I bet you've never even seen a real fight, right?" James Washington paused mid-mop and slowly looked up. At 42, he'd only been working at the gym for 3 weeks, always coming in after the students left. But that night, the advanced class had stayed late. "I don't want to interrupt, Sensei," James replied calmly, returning to the stain he'd been scrubbing. "Just trying to finish up so you can keep training." Derek threw his head back in a loud, exaggerated laugh that echoed across the room. "Everyone, check this out. He's too scared to even step on the mat." A few of the students snickered. It was a thin, uncomfortable sound. What none of them knew was that James had spent the last 20 years trying to bury the man he used to be, the legend he used to be. It had been 2 decades since the accident that drove him out of the ring forever. Even his teenage daughter had no idea who he once was. "Ah, come on," Derek pushed, strolling toward him with that smug grin he used to intimidate beginners. "Just a little demo. I bet you don't even know how to hold a proper guard. Show my students the difference between someone who trains and someone who just mops floors." Something deep inside James stirred, like an old engine turning over. After years of silence, his eyes met Derek's, and for a second or two something in that stare made the instructor's smile falter. "It is just a demonstration," Derek insisted, his voice tightening as a flicker of doubt crept in. "Nothing serious, just a lesson in respect." James set the bucket down and rose. Slowly the movements were fluid. Too fluid for one who claimed to have never set foot upon a mat. The students stirred around them, aware that something was about to go terribly wrong. "All right," James said quietly, his voice as still as water before the storm. "But afterwards, you're going to apologize for turning this mat into a circus." Derek laughed again, the edge gone from his voice. "You'll be the one apologizing when you end up face down on the floor?" None of them knew that James Washington had once been James Silent Storm Washington, a 5-time world MMA champion, a fighter so feared, opponents used to forfeit matches rather than face him. His career was over the day a tragic training accident took the life of his best friend and sparring partner. James walked away that day from the fame, the money, and the entire world of fighting. But some things, especially dignity, are worth breaking a promise for. If you are enjoying this story of justice and redemption, he continued, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. What happens next becomes the most humiliating lesson of Derek Mitchell's career. Derek straightened his belt dramatically and turned towards his students. Gather around. You're about to see why there's a hierarchy in martial arts. The 8 students formed a semicircle. Some looked intrigued, others uncomfortable. A young Asian woman tied her hair back and whispered to the student beside her. He only shook his head. Look at this, Derek announced, gesturing toward James. Perfect example of someone who doesn't understand his place. Elite gyms aren't meant for, well, you know. James felt a familiar sting in his chest. He had heard the same comments 20 years earlier, when people referred to him and others like him as fighters who did not look like champions. Now, at age 42, he no longer allowed anger to consume him. He knew to channel it into focus. Sensei, the young woman said quietly, perhaps we should go back to regular training. It is getting late. Sarah Chun, Derek said sharply. You're questioning my methods. Sit down. You'll learn more in the next 5 minutes than in a month of drills. James noticed how Derek used her full name, a power move meant to intimidate. He also recognized the fear flickering in her eyes. He had seen that same fear in himself years ago, waking from nightmares of the accident that killed Tony Hammer Rodriguez. Tony had been more than a teammate. He was a brother, and though the investigation ruled it an accident, James had never forgiven himself. One miscalculated combo, one unlucky fall, one wrong angle. Tony never opened his eyes again, and the silent storm fell silent. James had walked away from the ring because of moments like this. The pressure, the insults, the weight of being judged for the color of his skin. The last time he let anger get the best of him, his best friend paid the price, a memory that lived inside him like a scar he could never erase. So Janitor, Derek mocked loudly, circling him like a shallow predator. How about you show my students a basic guard? Or is that too complicated for a guy who only knows how to push a mop? Laughter rippled across the gym, but James didn't react. He merely closed his eyes for one long moment, and in that breath, he was no longer in Denver. He was back in Las Vegas, under blinding lights, hearing those very same hate-filled comments that sent him over the edge 2 decades earlier. What's wrong? Derek taunted, stepping closer. Scared? Or are you just gonna stand there like a lamppost with a mop? Then Derek made his first mistake. He shoved James's shoulder. It wasn't hard. It was just full of arrogance. The moment Derek's hand touched him, he knew something was wrong. James didn't move, not an inch. It felt like pushing a tree trunk rooted into the earth. Derek blinked. His smirk faltered. Interesting, James whispered softly. It's been a while since someone tried to wake the part of me you're poking at. Something in his voice just shifted the whole room. Not anger, not threat. Something much more dangerous. The quiet calm of a man who'd walked through hell and learned to control the fire. But Derek was too blinded by ego to sense what everyone else already felt. Did you hear that, guys? He barked. He thinks this is interesting? Let's show him the difference between thinking and knowing. Every mocking word Derek spoke only stirred something deep inside James. Not rage, clarity. The clarity of a fighter. A person who knew precisely what he was capable of, even after decades in the shadows. Sarah Chun watched from the sidelines, a deep unease tightening her chest. She knew what real danger was. It didn't roar. It breathed slow and steady. James wasn't bracing for a fight. He was remembering how to be who he once was. Last chance, Derek snapped, now impatient. Either you step onto the mat like a man, or I call security and have you removed. And yes, that means you lose your job. James opened his eyes. The moment their gazes met, Derek stiffened, as if a cold blade had touched his spine. It felt like waking a sleeping dragon. All right, James said quietly, but when this ends, you're going to explain to your students why you turned a place of learning into a stage for your own ego. Derek attempted to laugh, but the sound cracked. You'll be the one explaining when you're lying on the mat. James didn't reply. He didn't need to. For 2 decades, he had been taught to rein in the tempest within him, to transmute the rage into focus, to turn guilt into restraint. What Derek perceived as fear was the calm before the storm that heralded Silent Storm's awakening. Derek squared his shoulders and addressed the students, pleased by the attention. Gather round. You are in for a lesson that is better than 6 months of training. The difference between one who dedicates their life to the study of martial arts and someone who cleans the floor where the real fighters walk. The students formed a tight circle. Some moved forward eagerly. Others looked sick, but no one dared to utter a word. James stood in the center, his breathing slow, measured, his eyes drifted shut again, and suddenly he was back in the National Gymnasium in Las Vegas, hearing the jeers from the crowd. Look at that little black guy. Bet he won't last 3 rounds. He had won that fight, won it brutally, but the victory shattered him. The next day, his sparring session, fueled by grief, ended with Tony Rodriguez's lifeless body on the mat, and James had never fought again. Janitor, Derek said with disdain as he circled again. Show the class how not to do a guard, unless pushing a mop is all you know. This time, Sarah Chun stepped forward. Sensei Derek, she said firmly, can I ask you something? Derek didn't expect that. His eyebrows shot upwards, his face darkening in annoyance. Excuse me, Sarah, who's teaching this class? You are, she said, her voice steady. But teaching should not include humiliating a man for doing his job, and it definitely shouldn't involve hiding racism behind a lesson. The gym fell dead silent. The students fidgeted restlessly as Sarah's words bounced across the gym. Nobody had ever called Derek out that way. He forced a laugh, but it came out bitter. Racial, he scoffed. This has nothing to do with race. It has to do with knowing your place. James raised his head. There was something about Sarah's courage, her bold stance against a man twice her size, that touched a chord deep within him. She reminded him so much of his younger sister, Kesha, strong, undaunted, and never one to take any injustice lying down. Kesha died at 17, a stray bullet during a police standoff in her neighborhood. James was fighting in Japan when the news reached him. Yet another person he loved was gone while he was chasing glory in a distant ring. Her death was one of the reasons that he abandoned the limelight and slipped into an unremarkable life. Sarah, Derek said sharply, his voice icy, if you don't like my teaching methods, you're welcome to find another gym. There are places out there more suitable for people with your mindset. A threat hung in the air. Sarah's back straightened, though fear flickered in her eyes. My tuition is paid, Sensei, she said calmly, and I think everyone here deserves a training environment founded on respect, not humiliation. Then, something happened that no one was expecting. James smiled, not a timid smile, not a submissive smile, a slow, deliberative one, the kind a man wears when he finally stops running from who he is. For 20 years he lived beneath the weight of 2 tragedies he blamed himself for. But in that moment, with Sarah standing up for fairness and dignity, he remembered the fighter he once was. Derek, James said finally, his voice firm and authoritative. She's right. This isn't about martial arts. It's about you needing to feel big by belittling others. Derek turned toward him, his face suddenly pulsing with anger. Oh please, don't lecture me about martial arts. You don't even know what a dojo is. James took one step forward, and a world of change unfolded. His shoulders squared, His center dropped. His alignment shifted with the ease of a precision that spoke of one who had lived on the mat far longer than Derek ever had. Actually, James said quietly, I know exactly what a dojo is, and this place stopped being one a long time ago. A chill went through Derek. Something primal inside him recognized that shift, even if his pride refused to acknowledge it. That's enough talking, Derek growled, settling into his favorite fighting stance. I'll teach you respect the hard way. Sarah watched in a mix of dread and fascination. She had studied the psychology of combat for 2 years now, documented hundreds of professional fights, and the way the janitor moved, it reminded her of legends she had only ever seen in old championship footage. The poise, the breathing, the terrifying stillness. He closed his eyes, letting 2 decades of buried instinct rise to the surface. Every technique, every reflex, every ounce of skill he once used to dominate the world stage came back as naturally as breathing. When he opened his eyes again, Derek was staring into the gaze of Silent Storm Washington, 5-time world MMA champion. Last chance to apologize, James said softly, to her, to these students, and to the spirit of this place. Derek barked a laugh, but the sound shook. Apologize. Man, you'll be the one asking for mercy when I put you on the floor. What Derek didn't know was that James had already dissected him in seconds. The high guard that exposed his ribs, the predictable backward step of his right leg, the shoulder twitch that telegraphed every punch. 20 years away didn't erase a lifetime of mastery. The students instinctively huddled back from the mat, like animals sensing a shift in pressure before a storm. Derek struck what he considered his most proud stance, his chest puffed and fists raised. It was what had intimidated beginners for years. Yet to James it made him appear like a child emulating a fighter. James remained standing, watching him, analyzing him, breathing steadily. Still waiting, Derek jeered, bouncing lightly on the balls of his feet. Or are you going to stand there like a lamppost? And then James moved, not dramatically, but just a shift in weight, a slight bend of the knees, a quiet exhalation. But it was enough. Every trained eye in the room felt the temperature drop. Silent Storm had returned. To an untrained eye, James barely moved, but anyone who understood martial arts, anyone who had ever studied true mastery, felt the shift instantly. It was terrifying. The hairs rose along Sarah Chun's arms. She had spent 2 years researching sports biomechanics, analyzing thousands of frames of footage from Olympic champions to underground legends. What she had just seen wasn't a stance. It wasn't a pose. It was evolution, a predator waking up. Interesting, Derek muttered, but the quaver in his voice betrayed him. Something in the way James now stood, effortlessly commanding space, triggered every survival instinct Derek had. James stepped forward. Derek stepped back. He didn't mean to. His body reacted before his ego could stop it. The students noticed right away, a black belt retreating from the janitor. In an instant, the balance of power in the room had shifted completely. Problem? James asked softly, not threatening, not taunting, just certain. The single word froze the room. Derek's cheeks burned. His authority, his dominance, his reputation, all were slipping through his fingers. He scrambled for a joke. No problem, he forced out. Just admiring your posture. Did you learn that on YouTube? No one laughed. It was as if the gym was holding its breath. Actually, James replied evenly, I learned it at a place called the Las Vegas National Gym. Maybe you've heard of it. Derek frowned. The name tugged at a memory, but he couldn't place it. Las Vegas, he scoffed. What, you take a weekend boot camp there? Sarah slowly slipped her phone from her pocket, typed rapidly and froze. Her eyes widened. Her heart dropped. Las Vegas National Gym was not a weekend camp. It was the birthplace of champions, the training ground of the greatest fighters of the last 3 decades. And James was speaking of it like home. Derek, James said, his voice steady as stone, this is your last chance. Apologize to Sarah for dismissing her. Apologize to your students for humiliating them. And apologize to yourself for becoming everything a martial artist should never be. The gym fell absolutely silent. For one moment, literally one tiny moment, Derek could have salvaged what little dignity he had remaining. But pride is a loud master. He attacked. His first jab was text, book perfect, firm, speedy, and absolutely devastating. A dig like that has thrown dozens of contenders on the back foot. But James wasn't there. He didn't dodge. He flowed, sliding aside with liquid precision. Derek's fist cut through empty air, pulling him off balance. Nice try, James said softly. Technique solid, speed average, but you telegraphed it with your right shoulder. Derek whipped around, his bravado concealing a flicker of panic. How had the janitor vanished from his striking zone? He doubled down jab straight hook. His favorite trio, his signature combination. The one that was certain to impress novices and intimidate amateurs. James didn't block. He He just wasn't there where any punch landed. It was then that Sarah's trained eye could finally track it. Barely he managed to dip under the jab, missing it by inches. The straight whiffed past as he arched backward effortlessly. The hook cut through empty air as James took the lightest step back, like he knew the punch before Derek even threw it. That combo works, James said, completely calm. If the opponent stands still, but you're wide open on your left. Derek's breathing grew ragged, a bead of sweat trickling down his temple. His confidence, so painstakingly pulled together, began to unravel. Stop dancing and fight, he barked. But it sounded more like a plea than a command. James sighed. The demonstration had lasted long enough. Derek launched a furious barrage, punches, kicks, everything he could muster, each one slicing through nothing but air. But then something changed. When Derek reset his stance, trying desperately to regain control, James was suddenly closer. Too close. How? Derek breathed, his voice cracking. He had completely lost the ability to control distance, the most basic of all skills. James leaned in a bit, his voice benign, almost sympathetic. Derek, do you want to know the difference between someone who trains in gyms and someone who fought in world rings? Derek didn't respond. He couldn't. And then James did what nobody could fathom. He didn't hit. He didn't push. He just laid his hand on Derek's chest and pressed. It looked soft, effortless, almost casual, but Derek didn't fall backward. He flew. It was as if an invisible force had detonated through his torso. Derek was lifted off his feet, his body thrown nearly 2 meters across the mat. He went down flat on his back with a resounding crash. The gym gasped in unison. The silence swallowed the room whole. Derek lay on his back staring up at the ceiling, his mind racing to comprehend how a janitor had sent him flying with a touch. There was no pain, only the stunning shock of being exposed to a level of mastery beyond Derek's wildest imagination. Gasping, still fighting for normal breathing, he managed to stammer, That's impossible. Sarah Chun was frozen. She had studied martial arts technique and biomechanics for 2 years, and she had never seen anything like what James had just demonstrated. No rage, no aggression, just a clean and effortless execution of principles she had hitherto believed existed only in legend. Actually, said James calmly, extending his hand to Derek, it is simple, once you understand leverage, timing, and energy transfer. Things I learned over a 5-year professional career. Derek slapped the hand away and forced himself to his feet, his legs trembling beneath him. 22 years in what? He snapped, but Sarah already knew. You don't understand who he is, do you? She whispered, her voice shaking. Every head in the gym turned toward her. She held up her phone, the screen filled with articles, championship photos, fight posters, and headlines. James Washington, she read aloud, her voice steadying. Also known as Silent Storm, 5-time world mixed martial arts champion. Considered one of the greatest technical fighters in history, retired undefeated after a 5-year career, following the accidental death of his training partner. Her words fell like a bomb. The color instantly drained from Derek's face. He had not been mocking a janitor, a ghost from martial arts history, whom many fighters all over the world speak with awe. 5, Derek stammered. 5-time world champion. James nodded quietly. I retired at 29 since then. I've just taken whatever jobs I could find. Cleaning, maintenance, simple work, simple life, no cameras, no crowds, nothing to prove. The arrogance left Derek in an instant, replaced by something raw and fragile, humility, born of fear. I didn't know, he whispered. If I had known, if you had known, James gently cut in, would you have treated me with respect? Or would you have found another janitor to bully? Someone without a reputation to defend themselves? The question pierced deeper than any strike. Sarah stepped forward. Sensei Derek, she said firmly, for 2 years I respected you because I believed you represented this art. But what happened today wasn't teaching. It was bullying, nothing more. Murmurs of assent circled the room. In that instant, James had popped the balloon of Derek's authority. Respect had switched sides. James, Derek whispered, desperate, I'm sorry truly to you, to Sarah, to everyone. I have no excuse. James nodded. Apology accepted, but apologies are easy, change is harder. What are you going to do differently from now on? He gazed around at his students in the gym, finding judgment, disappointment, and cold reality on all their faces. I'll change, he said softly. I have to. Then Sarah turned to James. Mr. Washington, would you consider teaching again? Not just technique, but what you showed tonight. Responsibility, respect, discipline. We need someone like that. For the first time that night, James smiled. A warm, genuine smile that softened the intensity of the moment. Maybe, he said, but if I teach, it won't be about fighting. It'll be about character. 3 months later, the gym was unrecognizable. James Washington was no longer the janitor. He was now a well-respected instructor, not for beginners, but advanced ones, studying philosophy, discipline, and the deeper meaning of martial arts. Sarah had convinced the gym owner to hire him, after presenting video evidence of that fateful night. As for Derek, half of his students left in a week. The video Sarah had quietly recorded went viral, a black belt being effortlessly humbled by a man they thought was just a janitor. His reputation plummeted. His ego was shattered. He had to start all over in a far smaller gym, teaching in humility rather than pride. One evening, after a class, Sarah approached James. "Sensei, James," she said softly, "thank you for showing me that real strength doesn't need to be advertised. It speaks for itself." James smiled as he organized equipment. "The greatest lesson is simple," he said. "Never judge someone by their job, their clothes, or what you think they are. Everyone carries a story, and sometimes that story will surprise you." Derek learned the hard way, because sometimes justice doesn't arrive with fists or fury. Sometimes justice arrives quietly, like a storm that leaves everything changed without making a sound. And James proved once and for all that true greatness comes, not from titles, but from character. If this story inspired you, make sure to like, subscribe,